Hey guys, I'm Alex, and today I want to talk to you about why I find language so fascinating. This video is going to be a little bit more off the cuff and just off the top of my head, but I really want to share with you how language spells out all of history, but instead of it looking from this top-down view of what were the wars that were fought or what leader backstabbed another, we're looking at who the people were that lived in every age from 10,000 years ago when we first started seeing social human behavior all the way to the present. And so for me, that comes through 50% studying the language itself, which is looking at what kinds of vocabulary words do these people use? Like if you're looking at Spanish in different South American countries versus Spanish in Spain versus Spanish in Puerto Rico or something, those are all going to use different slang. They're going to use different references to different events because different things happen in those places. They celebrate different holidays. It makes a huge difference, and your language in many ways describes the shared events that you've experienced as a culture. And then on the other end, you've got things like the evolution of language. How does one language turn into another? Take, for example, in Southern Europe, we started with Latin, and then we got French, Romanian, Italian, and Spanish, and a lot of it has even trickled into English. And then Latin itself changed over the course of 2,500 years. And it even trickled into Greek and Phoenician and Semitic languages. So it's really important that we learn about language because it's going to tell us how did we get to the point where Earth is today. And to touch on that, there's a lot of conflicts today that can be understood in the context of language. So even post-Korean War, I'll say, when the US was over there, you start seeing the integration of English words into Korean. And then I'm studying it right now, which is partially why I bring that up as an example. But even before that, you can tell that Western culture affected Eastern Asia and specifically Korea because there are words like pangi, which is the Korean word for bread, but it's adopted from the Portuguese word for bread. And it's not like Portuguese went all across mainland Europe and then across mainland Asia to get there. It's because of the trade. And you had and some of this is going to be postulation because my history is not 100% accurate, but this is from what I remember. You had the Caribbean trade that brought goods from Europe to then South America and the Caribbean, and then you had a secondary trade where you were exchanging silver between Chile and China, and things between those regions, and suddenly you have Portuguese-speaking sailors who have now made it all the way across the world and are introducing new types of food to people from that part of the world. Same thing with integrating corn into a Chinese diet. Corn is a South American crop, but through the interaction between these sailors who were trying to trade other things, it became a staple part of a Chinese diet. And we see this story time and time again because it's not just wars or people becoming friends or something that changes a language. It's so much more subtle than that and so much more grandiose than that. And for grandiose, it's people invade somewhere and then suddenly you have a new word to describe people who act like that. Like crazy rulers who are like Nero, who was a dictator in Rome. And he famously played the lute or something as Rome burned. Then you have these subtle events like the word legit, for example. That right there is an example of linguistic evolution because you started with the word legitimate, which was a fringe word. Not too many people used it unless they were using it exactly by the dictionary definition of this is something that's a verifiable fact or truth. It is true. But then legit is the result of it kind of gets integrated into mainstream culture. Some few people pick it up and they're like, bruh, that was legitimate. And then that's sounding really awkward because most of the words we use in short conversation are short words. There's not a whole lot of reason to have a long word when you can have a shorter version of it, right? We used to say you are and now we say you're, or I am going to and now I'm gonna. We start to compress things, and that's kind of how we get a lot of slang, and then eventually it becomes, in many cases, an actual word in the language. But in the case of legitimate, shave a few letters off, you have legit. But then even that gets said so frequently because now it's an easier word to say. It stands for something that there's no other word in the English language that really means the exact same thing. And then that word goes from legit to lit. And now you've got something that you can just say on the fly, and you can add it to whatever you're saying. It's fire, it's cool. And all of these slang words have a different meaning from what they used to mean. And that just happened within the last 20, 30 years as we start seeing this burgeoning new part of the English language. And even furthermore, because of internet culture, we start seeing people in other parts of the world using these sounds and characters and words in their languages that aren't evolved from words that previously existed in their language. And a good example of that is like the French word for computer, which is an interesting case because when the computer first came out, you had le computer, which is literally the computer. And in Italian and in Spanish, you still see a lot of like words that sound exactly like computer, like computadora. But then in French, there was some backlash because the French have a society that specifically controls what words enter the language officially because they're trying to maintain like the Frenchness of French, which makes sense. There are a lot of dying languages, and even the ones that are surviving, you want to maintain what makes them that. Like part of maintaining culture is maintaining the shared vocabulary and the shared history of your language and your people. And so they changed the word to a much more French word, which instead of le computer was l'ordinateur, which now reflects the origin of the French word and is derived from French words. And we kind of see all sorts of varieties of this happening everywhere. But in the case of France, it reflects either the French societies or the French academic society or the French people's will to maintain this like fine-tuning of their culture that is French through and through, while still accepting new words from other parts of the world. But then like with Korean culture, you don't have that option for bread, for example, because while there may have been some like wheat crops growing in Korea, it was mostly a rice-based diet. And really like the consistency that comes with bread that is like bread brought over from Europe or from South America is just a different consistency entirely. So rather than trying to adopt it, it just becomes the new word. And it happens when someone like tries the food that you brought with you for lunch from your ship. And they're like, what's that called? And you say, that's bread. Now it's bread. It is bread to them because it is different from what they had and they had no other word to call it by. But to some degree, this is all a tangent. These are examples of like minute ways in which language has changed because of some small event. But really, language reflects the people's thinking. And you can see it in art where a moment is captured and you're looking at like, oh, why are these characters situated in the painting the way they are? Like paintings took a really long time to make. So most parts of the painting are going to be very deliberate. You're going to have a person turn a specific way to almost be like angled at the camera when they like strike a sword down over this mythological enemy of the people. And then they're the hero because they didn't just defeat the enemy. They defeated it heroically and with the breath of Rome in them. It symbolizes the way people feel about a moment. And language does that even more fine-tuned, in a more fine-tuned way. Because now we're not just talking about something that takes eras or years to paint, but we're talking about something that in every single moment is reflective of how not only what's going on, but how the speaker feels about it. So when we read a text from Rome from like, right at the end, right, in, it was like 400-ish CE, forgive my poor dates, we can see the reflection of how the fall of Rome is seen through the people's eyes as this end of a cultural renaissance, of this era of having, having glorious art and a connected society in the Pax Romana where you have peace throughout the region and a collected, unified government. And now we start to see individual cultures burgeoning, and we start to see like Rome as it decays under financial strains and under attacks from like northern tribes. And while it's disintegrating, people are writing about it. They're writing about their experiences of having to move, and sometimes it's just private thoughts in a journal that gets discovered hundreds of years later, or sometimes it's official decrees of, look, we're getting rid of your province because it's not profitable. That can happen too. And 100 or 1,000 years from now, people are going to be looking at like company official statements of like, oh, COVID happened and we had to close this sector of our company. And then it's not just a matter of, oh, COVID was happening, but when historians look back at today, they're going to be like, COVID was happening and people reluctantly had to do this, or the only way to keep companies alive was to foreclose them, or everyone took a pay cut because they didn't want to foreclose. And that's going to set the tone of what was each company like during this era. But to kind of conclude this all, there is a story that's told by language that is got much more minutia, much more drama, and much more tragedy, but also much more joy and elation than a simple history textbook can tell you. Because when you learn a language, you're learning a time period, you're learning the vocabulary, you're learning the food, you're learning the taste, the smells, the color of everything around you. And I'll give you one last example. There is an island that was in the Pacific that had somewhere around like 30 or 40 words for just the colors green and blue, which is really fascinating when you think about it, because like we call green and blue by 2 words, maybe 3 if you like the color teal. But for them, it meant something different. When you rely on the ocean to survive, every single word in your language that describes a color of the ocean really, really matters. And so you're talking about like when the sea is rough, it looks a certain way. When the water is deep, it looks a certain color. When it's peaceful, or when it's prime for fishing, or when a storm is rolling in, all of those reflect a different color, and they can even see that difference. But then you bring it over to the other side of the world, and it's not important to that culture, or to our culture in America, because we don't necessarily depend on the ocean like that. But then we've got a much wider variety of colors that we can express in our language, versus for them, there pretty much were no other colors that were described with color words other than those blues and greens. Because for them, red was like the color of the night sky under certain conditions. Yellow was the color of the sun, so it's just referred to as like sun color or something along those lines. And then colors like purple may not have even had a word because they didn't appear in nature, so it's not likely to be necessary. And so what I'm getting at here is that when you look at just a few words, you can tell a lot about the lifestyle of people long after they've been gone. It doesn't need to be this thing where like you're here right now and like you're intensely studying it out of a book. Like every single word that you learn from a language means something. When I say like, it was my pleasure to meet you, that's different from cool or nice seeing you, bro. Like everything means something slightly different, and it reflects how you feel, but it also reflects the history that's led up to this moment. So yeah, ultimately history is a story best told through language and through art and through culture, but language is the medium through which we capture everything in that moment. And we can talk about it to our friends, and we can give our opinions, and it's the medium of human communication. So if there was ever a way to figure out what someone was thinking or feeling, it's gonna be through language. But I want you guys to understand how important language is to understanding humans, and that my fascination with it, which we'll uncover as I talk to you about like Italian, Greek, Russian, and how like all these languages evolved from like common ancestors and how they also didn't. How that reflects people's migration across the world, where people were running from dictators, where they were starving economically, where they were happy to accept a new culture, or where they converted religions, or where they just found a home for themselves and adopted these words because they were part of their identity now. There's a lot to uncover on planet Earth. I think a good place to start is understanding how we got to this point, historically, culturally, economically, governmentally, because where we're going is dependent on where we are, and where we are is dependent on where we came from. And if you can understand this chronology, you've not only found a way to now do something about the world you live in because you understand how it works and how it is the way it is, but you've also set a standard for understanding the single most fascinating story ever written. Because it's the story of ourselves, and unlike a novel that has like a point A to a point B where it's going from and to, and it's got X many characters and they've all got certain motives and certain personality traits, history is 10 billion plus people over the course of history who've all had unique personalities, unique motives, and they're all interwoven in a story, not just with 5 or 6 other people, but with everyone on Earth. And they're all trying to achieve something that manifests not just in their own small-scale interactions, but in the things that they vote for, in the people that they talk to, in the goods that they trade, and the laws that they break, because it all unfolds into this wild, wild adventure of who attacks who and who gets to tell history and why it matters to them that this story get told. Is it for self-glory or for preservation? Is it for exploration or demonization? And that ultimately determines the story that you learn in class and in school and in conversations with one another, but it also is the history that you will tell your kids and they'll tell their kids, and that one day historians will look back and uncover about us. So, with all that being said, I'm sure that was an earful, but I hope you guys did enjoy getting an insight into what makes language so intertwined with history and why the two of them are so fascinating. And we'll certainly be talking about it a lot more. But it's been my pleasure talking to you guys today, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week.